A man can lose a roof over his head, the money in his pocket, and even the courage to look strangers in the eye. But sometimes, when life has stripped everything away, one small thing can still remain strong enough to pull him back from the edge. For Samuel Reed, that thing was not a bank account, a family name, or a piece of land forgotten in the Montana hills. It was a brass key, worn smooth by hands that were gone now. And it was a German shepherd named Duke, who somehow knew the way home before Samuel did. The morning the letter arrived, rain was falling hard over Billings, Montana. It came down in steady gray sheets, turning the sidewalks dark and shiny and making the whole city look as if someone had washed the color out of it. Cars hissed past the curb. Water dripped from the metal roof of the bus shelter. People moved quickly with their collars up, eyes lowered, phones in their hands, trying not to notice the old man sitting on a bench near the edge of a small public park. Samuel was used to not being noticed. At 71, he had learned that invisibility could happen slowly. First, people stopped asking what you did for a living. Then they stopped asking where you were headed. Then one day they looked right through you, as if age and poverty had made you part of the sidewalk. He sat with his back straight anyway. Some habits survived everything. His navy cap was old, the bill soft from years of use. His jacket had been patched twice at the elbow. White stubble covered his jaw. Beneath the collar of his shirt, hidden unless he moved just right, was a faded tattoo of a German shepherd, inked over his heart after a war most people had only read about. His hands were large, scarred, and steady, though the cold made the knuckles ache. At his feet lay Duke. The dog was 7 years old, a broad-chested German shepherd with a black saddle across his back and amber eyes that seemed to understand more than any animal should. Rain clung to his fur, but he did not complain. He never did. When Samuel slept in his truck, Duke curled against him for warmth. When Samuel skipped meals, Duke still waited patiently until food came. When men in parking lots shouted at Samuel to move along, Duke stood between them without growling, quiet and solid as a wall. That dog had seen him fall apart and never once looked ashamed of him. Samuel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and touched the envelope again. He had opened it twice already, then folded it carefully, as if the paper might change if he read it too much. The envelope had come from a law office downtown. Thick cream-colored paper. Formal lettering. A seal pressed into the corner. When Samuel first saw it in the general delivery mail at the post office, he assumed it was one more notice he could not answer. A bill. A collection letter. A reminder that the world remembered what he owed, even when it forgot what he had given. But it was not a bill. It was a summons of another kind. His grandmother, Margaret Reed, had passed away. Samuel had stood under the awning outside the post office for a long time after reading those words. Rain had struck the pavement around his boots. Duke had leaned against his leg, sensing the change in him before Samuel understood it himself. Margaret Reed. He had not said her name out loud in years. She had been the kind of woman who could make a kitchen feel like a church and a church feel like home. She baked pies without measuring, kept a Bible full of pressed wildflowers, and had a laugh that filled every corner of the old house outside Livingston where Samuel had spent part of his childhood. She believed in discipline, forgiveness, and feeding anyone who walked through her door. When Samuel was 10 and angry at the world because his father had disappeared for weeks at a time, it was his grandmother who taught him to split firewood, polish boots, and say what hurt instead of breaking what was nearby. Then life had stretched between them. There were deployments. There were missed birthdays. There were letters he meant to answer and never did. There was pride on both sides of the family, the kind that made people wait too long to make the first call. Years went by. His grandmother grew older. Samuel grew harder. By the time he came back from the Navy for good, he was not the same young man who had left Montana. With his chest full of purpose, he carried things no one could see. For a while, he managed. He worked private security. He drove delivery routes. He rented a small apartment on the second floor of an old brick building. It was nothing fancy, but it was clean, warm, and his. Then came the surgery. Then the insurance problems. Then a debt he thought he could handle became 3 debts he could not. The truck needed repairs. The rent went up. A job ended with one polite phone call and no severance. By winter, his savings were gone. By spring, so was the apartment. He had told himself it would be temporary. A few nights in the truck. A few weeks until he found work. But temporary hardship had a way of becoming a new address when shame kept you from asking for help. Through all of it, Duke stayed. Samuel looked down at him now. The dog lifted his head, water shining along his muzzle. "We have an appointment," Samuel said quietly. Duke's tail moved once against the wet concrete. The law office was on the third floor of a brick building with brass elevator doors and quiet carpeted halls. Samuel hesitated outside the entrance before going in. He looked at his reflection in the glass door and saw exactly what others saw: an old man with tired eyes, damp clothes, and a service dog who was not officially a service dog, but had saved his life more than once. The receptionist glanced up when he entered. Her eyes flicked to Duke, then to Samuel's worn jacket. To her credit, her expression softened instead of tightening. "Mr. Reed?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Whitaker is expecting you." The attorney was an elderly man with silver hair, careful hands, and the kind of voice people used in rooms where death had recently been discussed. His office smelled of old paper, leather chairs, and coffee that had been sitting too long on a warmer. Rain tapped against tall windows behind his desk. Samuel sat across from him with Duke beside the chair. "I'm sorry for your loss," Mr. Whitaker said. Samuel nodded. "Thank you." He wanted to say more. He wanted to ask whether she had suffered, whether she had asked about him, whether her hands had still smelled faintly of lavender the way they did when he was a boy. But the question stuck somewhere below his throat. The attorney opened a folder. "Your grandmother left very specific instructions." Samuel braced himself for nothing. Maybe a family photograph. Maybe one of her old Bibles. Maybe a note telling him she forgave him for staying away. Mr. Whitaker reached into a desk drawer and lifted out a small wooden box. He placed it between them. Samuel stared at it. The attorney opened the lid. Inside was a single brass key. Nothing else. Samuel waited, certain there had to be another sentence coming. When none came, he looked up. "That's it." Mr. Whitaker nodded. "That and an address." He slid a folded piece of paper across the desk. Samuel opened it slowly. The address was outside a small town nearly 2 hours away, in a part of Montana he had not visited since he was a teenager. The numbers stirred something in him, but not enough for recognition to settle fully. "What does the key open?" Samuel asked. The attorney folded his hands. "Your grandmother wanted you to discover that yourself." Samuel gave a dry little laugh. "That sounds like her. She never liked explaining a lesson until you'd already learned it the hard way." Mr. Whitaker smiled faintly. "She was a remarkable woman." She was. The words came out rougher than Samuel expected. He picked up the key. It was heavier than it looked, old brass scratched by years of use. Not a modern house key from a hardware store. This key had history in it. The edges were worn smooth where fingers had turned it again and again. "Why me?" Samuel asked. The attorney's expression shifted. "She said you would ask that." Samuel looked up. Mr. Whitaker opened another paper, but did not hand it over. "She asked me to tell you something exactly, if you came here. If she knew you might not." That landed harder than Samuel wanted to admit. The attorney continued gently. Her words were, "When Samuel reaches the house, tell him not to ignore the dog." Silence settled across the room. Samuel looked down at Duke. The German shepherd was staring at the key. For one foolish second, Samuel almost expected the dog to speak. "Don't ignore the dog," he repeated. "Yes." Samuel closed his fingers around the brass key. "She always did trust animals more than people." "Sometimes with good reason," Mr. Whitaker said. Samuel slipped the key into his pocket and stood. The attorney handed him a few formal documents, then offered his condolences again. Samuel thanked him because manners mattered, especially when your life looked like it had forgotten them. Outside, the rain had slowed to a fine mist. He stood beneath the building awning and unfolded the address again. Duke sat beside him, watching the street, then turned his head toward the west as if he already knew the road. Samuel should have been skeptical. He should have gone back to his truck, found a safe place to park for the night, and thought it over. A mysterious key from a dead grandmother did not erase medical debt. It did not put gas in the tank or food in Duke's bowl for long. It did not rebuild a man's life. Still, something had shifted. For the first time in months, Samuel had somewhere to go that was not simply away. He looked at Duke. "What do you think, boy?" Duke stood. That was answer enough. Before Samuel climbed into his old pickup, he sat for a moment with one hand on the steering wheel and the other on Duke's head. The rain blurred the windshield. The city moved around them, busy and indifferent. If you're listening to this story, Samuel might have said if he had known how many people would someday hear it. Tell me where you're watching from. And if you believe loyalty can lead a person back to the life they were meant to live, then stay with us. Some doors only open when someone refuses to leave your side. Then he turned the key in the ignition, and the truck rumbled to life. By late afternoon, the rain clouds had broken apart. Montana opened around them in long stretches of highway, rolling pasture, silver rivers, and distant mountains blue against the horizon. Samuel drove with the window cracked, letting in air that smelled of wet grass and pine. Duke sat upright beside him, unusually alert. Every few miles, Samuel glanced over and found the dog staring through the windshield. "You know something I don't?" he asked. Duke did not look away. The address led them off the main highway, then onto a county road that narrowed with every mile. Cottonwoods lined the shoulders. Old fence posts leaned into weeds. The landscape seemed to slip backward through time, away from strip malls and gas stations, away from traffic lights and debt collectors, back toward a quieter world where the sky was larger and the past had room to breathe. Then Samuel saw the mailbox. It leaned at the end of a gravel lane, weathered gray, half swallowed by tall grass. The painted numbers were faded but still visible. They matched the address. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "This is it," he said. Duke rose from his seat before the truck had fully stopped. The gravel road stretched nearly half a mile through a stand of old trees. At the end of it stood a two-story farmhouse surrounded by a wide meadow and backed by dark pines. The house was larger than Samuel remembered, though memory came back slowly, like a photograph developing in a tray. White paint peeled from the siding. Ivy climbed part of the chimney. Dust covered the windows. The porch sagged slightly at one corner, but the bones of the place were strong. Samuel parked near the front steps and turned off the engine. For a long moment, he did not move. He knew this house, not in the clear way a person recognizes an address, but in the deeper way the body remembers before the mind catches up. He remembered bare feet on porch boards warmed by summer sun. He remembered his grandmother calling him in for supper. He remembered a maple tree in the yard and a rope swing that had once left blisters on his palms. "This was hers," he whispered. Duke jumped down from the truck and did not sniff the tires, the grass, or the porch posts. He walked straight to the front door. Samuel followed more slowly. Each step stirred another memory. The porch swing was gone, but the hooks remained. A rusted wind chime hung near the door, silent in the still air. He took the brass key from his pocket. It fit perfectly. The lock turned with a soft, decisive click. Samuel closed his eyes for half a second. Then he pushed the door open. The house smelled of dust, aged wood, old books, and something faintly sweet beneath it all. Lavender. His grandmother's scent. Sunlight entered through tall windows and fell across furniture covered in white sheets. Family photographs lined the hallway walls. A grandfather clock stood near the staircase, stopped at 4:17. Dust floated in the air as if the house itself had exhaled. Samuel stepped inside and removed his cap. He had been in abandoned buildings before. This did not feel abandoned. It felt preserved. Waiting. Duke entered beside him. For several seconds, the dog stood still. Then his ears lifted. He moved past the staircase, past the parlor, past the dining room where a long table sat beneath a chandelier wrapped in cobwebs. He headed down a narrow hallway at the back of the house with the focus of a working dog following a scent. Samuel's skin prickled. "Duke." The German shepherd stopped in front of a closed wooden door. Unlike the rest of the hallway, this door looked newer, cleaner. Someone had cared for it. Someone had oiled the hinges, polished the knob, and kept the frame from warping. Duke sat down directly in front of it and stared at the handle. "Do not ignore the dog." Samuel tried the knob. Locked. He looked at the key in his hand. The front door had opened, but the shape of the key suggested it belonged to more than one lock. Slowly, he inserted it. Another click. The door opened a few inches. Cool air drifted out. Samuel pushed it open. The room beyond was a study. It was smaller than he expected, but nothing about it felt ordinary. A wooden desk sat beneath a window covered by lace curtains, yellowed with age. Bookshelves lined 2 walls from floor to ceiling. An old reading chair rested near a stone fireplace. A lamp stood on the desk beside a framed photograph. The room was cleaner than the rest of the house, as if it had been sealed against time. Duke stepped in first. Samuel followed. The photograph on the desk showed Margaret Reed standing beside a young boy with crooked teeth and sunburned cheeks. Samuel recognized himself at 10 years old. He was holding a fishing pole, grinning as if the world had never heard him yet. His grandmother's arm rested around his shoulders. Samuel picked up the frame with both hands. "I'm sorry," he said before he could stop himself. The room gave no answer. He set the photograph down and began opening drawers. The top held stationery and a dried fountain pen. The second held envelopes, old stamps, and a pair of reading glasses. The third drawer contained letters tied with a blue ribbon. He touched them but did not untie them yet. It felt too much like reaching into someone's private grief. Duke crossed the room. The dog stood before the center bookcase and stared. Samuel waited. Duke nudged the lower shelf with his nose. A hollow thump sounded behind the wood. Samuel straightened. "Well," he murmured. That was not a normal shelf. He knelt and ran his fingers along the trim. Dust coated the edges. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then, near the bottom corner, almost hidden beneath the shadow of the shelf, he found a small brass latch no bigger than a dime. He pressed it. Nothing happened. He pressed harder. A faint click sounded inside the wall, and the entire center section of the bookcase shifted outward by an inch. Samuel stared at it. Duke sat, calm as a judge. Samuel pulled carefully. The shelf swung open on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow, concealed compartment. Inside sat a small wooden chest covered in dust. He carried it to the desk. The chest was handmade, dark with age, and carved on the lid with two initials, MR. The lock matched the brass key. Samuel slid the key in and turned it. The lid opened. Inside lay a leather journal, several envelopes, a bundle of folded maps, and a single sheet of paper resting on top. His grandmother's handwriting covered it. He recognized that handwriting instantly. Strong lines, gentle curves, practical and graceful all at once. He unfolded the page. "If you found this, then you finally listened to the dog." Samuel laughed once, softly, and the sound broke into something close to a sob. Duke rested his head against Samuel's knee. The letter continued. "My dear Samuel, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are standing exactly where I hoped you would stand someday. I know you may be angry with me for leaving you questions instead of answers, but you were always best when you had to follow a trail. The key was never only for the front door. The house was only the beginning." Samuel sat slowly in the desk chair. Outside, evening settled over the meadow. Inside, the old study seemed to gather around him. His grandmother explained that the house had been in the family for generations, though not always safely. She wrote of promises made and broken, land records misplaced, neighbors pressured to sell, and men who smiled at kitchen tables while quietly taking what was not theirs. "Do not assume this is about money," she wrote. "Money is the bait. Truth is the hook." Samuel read the sentence twice. He opened the journal. At first, the entries were ordinary. Holidays, weather, church potlucks, notes about the garden, which year the apple trees bloomed early, which cousin broke an arm falling from the hayloft. But as the dates moved forward, the tone changed. Names appeared again and again. Victor Langford, Langford Development, Northern Mineral Holdings, County Survey Office, missing plat map, unanswered letter. There were dates, property descriptions, and notes written in the margins. Margaret had not simply kept a diary. She had built a record. Samuel turned pages until the light faded, and he had to find a lamp. The electricity, to his surprise, still worked in part of the house. He plugged in the desk lamp, and warm light filled the study. Duke slept near the door for a while. Then, near midnight, he lifted his head. Samuel stopped reading. The house was silent. Duke stood and moved to the window. Samuel followed, careful not to make noise. Across the meadow, beyond the trees near the gravel lane, headlights appeared. A vehicle slowed near the property line. It stopped there for several seconds, lights dimmed by distance and branches. Then it turned around and disappeared. Samuel stayed at the window long after the lights were gone. The road ended at the house. No one had any reason to stop there by mistake. He looked at the journal spread open on the desk. Whatever his grandmother had hidden, someone else might still want it. He slept in the study that night with Duke beside him and the brass key under his hand. The dog kept looking east. Samuel remembered the sketch in the journal. A small map of the property. A circle drawn around a wooded section beyond the meadow. He returned to the study, took the folded photograph from the journal, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. In the picture, Margaret stood beside an older man near a small stone structure Samuel did not remember. On the back she had written, "The truth begins where the stones meet." "All right," Samuel said. "Let's see where the stones meet." Duke was already moving. After nearly 30 minutes, the trees opened into a clearing. The stone structure stood ahead. It was small, no bigger than a garden shed, built from rough gray stones stacked by hand. Moss covered the north wall. Ivy climbed one corner. A weathered wooden door hung beneath a simple stone lintel. The building looked ancient, but solid, as if the earth had decided to keep it. Samuel took the photograph from his pocket. Same doorway, same stones, same clearing. Duke stood before the door. A rusted iron lock hung from it. Samuel removed the brass key. The key turned. He was no longer surprised, but the sound still moved through him like a bell. Inside, the air was cool and dry. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with wooden boxes, file folders, journals, framed photographs, and metal containers. Someone had gone to great trouble to protect this place from weather. There was a small table, 2 chairs, and a narrow cabinet against the rear wall. This was not storage. It was an archive. Samuel stepped in slowly. On the first shelf, a box was labeled Family Records. Another said Photographs 1920 to 1978. A third carried the words County Copies. He opened it and found property deeds, survey maps, tax receipts, correspondence, and carbon copies of letters sent to attorneys and officials. Duke went straight to the metal cabinet. On top of it lay an envelope. For Samuel only. His hands trembled as he opened it. "My dear grandson, if you found this place," then Duke did what I asked him to do without ever needing words. "This building was your grandfather's work. He built it after the first set of records disappeared. He said stone keeps secrets better than wood. I pray it kept them long enough." Samuel lowered himself into a chair. The letter explained what the journal had only hinted at. Decades earlier, the Reed family had owned far more land than the house, meadow, and surrounding woods. Some parcels had been sold honestly. Others had been lost through unclear agreements, questionable surveys, and legal descriptions so confusing that older relatives signed papers they did not fully understand. The reason, Margaret wrote, was not the land anyone could see. It was what lay beneath it. Mineral rights. Samuel read the words carefully. In Montana, land could carry layers of ownership most people never thought about. Surface rights, mineral rights, access rights, leases, royalties. A family could sell one thing and keep another without realizing what mattered most had been separated years before. Margaret had learned that the family property and several neighboring properties sat near a valuable mineral formation. Reports had been created before many of the sales and transfers. Some people knew, others did not. The ones who knew had made fortunes. The ones who did not had signed away futures for modest checks and polite promises. Samuel spent hours reading. His grandmother's records were meticulous. She had copies of deeds from the county clerk, letters from surveyors, old tax maps, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes from conversations with neighbors who had since passed away. She never wrote like a woman making wild accusations. She wrote like someone preparing for the day doubt would be used against her. At noon, Samuel ate crackers from his pack and shared jerky with Duke. Then he continued. The same name appeared again and again. Victor Langford. At first, Victor had been a young real estate advisor. Later, a developer. Later still, the quiet partner behind companies that purchased land throughout the county. His name did not appear on every deal, but Margaret's notes connected him to many of them. She had drawn lines between people, businesses, and dates with the patience of someone who understood that truth often hid in paperwork no one wanted to read. Samuel opened a folder labeled Final Proof. Inside were copies of an independent geological report, correspondence between Victor Langford and an attorney, and an original survey map marked confidential. The report identified valuable mineral rights beneath a section of Reed family land years before several relatives had been convinced to sell. The later sales documents made no clear mention of that report. Samuel sat back. He had seen men lie before. He had seen lies dressed up in flags, contracts, handshakes, and clean suits. This was the same old sin in a different uniform. Duke lifted his head. Samuel listened. A branch cracked somewhere outside the clearing. Duke stood, ears sharp, body still. Samuel moved quietly to the doorway. The woods looked empty. Sunlight shifted through the trees. Wind moved the branches. Yet Duke continued staring toward the western edge of the clearing until the silence settled again. Only then did the dog relax. Samuel did not. He gathered the most important folders and placed them on the table. He would need help. County officials, an attorney, maybe a historian who understood old land records. But he also knew better than to walk into an office waving papers and demanding justice. His grandmother had waited decades. He could afford to be careful. Duke had other plans. The dog wandered to a stack of crates near the back wall and pawed once at the stone floor. Samuel looked over. What now? Duke pawed again. Samuel moved the crates. Beneath dust and dry leaves, a metal ring was set into a rectangular stone slab. It was almost invisible unless someone knew where to look. He pulled the ring. The slab shifted. Beneath it lay a waterproof metal box. Samuel stared at Duke. You have been holding out on me. The dog blinked. The metal box opened without a key. Inside were photographs, a flash drive in a sealed plastic case, several envelopes, and original documents protected in sleeves. One envelope carried Margaret's handwriting. If they ever come back, this is what they were looking for. Samuel's mouth went dry. He opened it. The documents inside were older and more important than anything in the cabinet. Original survey field notes. The first geological assessment. Private correspondence. Showing that Victor Langford had known about the mineral report before advising several family members to sell. There were copies of checks, dates, and handwritten notations that suggested payments had moved through companies with different names, but the same people behind them. At the bottom was a photograph. Margaret stood on the porch of the house beside a younger Victor Langford. He was handsome in a polished way, with careful hair and an easy smile. Margaret looked younger too, trusting, proud, and unaware of the wound standing beside her. Samuel turned the photograph over. We trusted the wrong person. The words sat in his hand like a verdict. Outside, an engine sounded. Samuel moved to the doorway. At the far edge of the meadow, half hidden between trees, sat a dark SUV. It had not been there when they arrived. Duke stood beside Samuel, silent and rigid. The SUV remained for nearly 3 minutes. No one got out. No window lowered. Then the vehicle reversed slowly and disappeared behind the pines. Samuel returned to the table and gathered the documents into a stack. For the first time since finding the key, he understood the danger was not imaginary. Someone had been watching the property. Someone knew Margaret had hidden something. And if they knew Samuel had found it, the old game might not be over. He did not sleep at the house that night. Instead, he locked the archive, packed the most important documents into a duffel bag, and drove into town with Duke beside him. From a bright diner parking lot, he called Mara Ellison, an old Navy friend who had become a property attorney in Bozeman. Shame had kept him from calling her for years, but the first thing she asked was not why he had disappeared. She asked, "Are you safe?" By morning, Mara was at the farmhouse with a scanner, a laptop, and the sharp focus of someone who knew evidence mattered more than outrage. Together they copied everything, secured the originals, and built a record that could survive pressure. When she saw the geological report, her joke stopped. "Samuel," she said quietly, "your grandmother may have uncovered fraud." He looked toward Margaret's photograph on the desk. "She told me the truth had to survive." Mara nodded. "Then we make sure it does." Over the next few weeks, the hidden life of Margaret Reed came into the light. Mara contacted 2 independent property attorneys, a retired county clerk known for hating sloppy records, and a university historian who specialized in land use and mineral rights in the Mountain West. Samuel expected skepticism. He got some, but Margaret's evidence had weight. She had saved original envelopes, notarized copies, dated notes, old photographs, receipts, and letters written before anyone knew they would matter. Truth, it turned out, was patient. It had been waiting in stone. County officials opened an internal review 2 weeks later. At first, the language was careful. Records would be examined. Historical discrepancies would be evaluated. No conclusions had been reached. But in a small county, careful language did not prevent people from talking. Neighbors began calling. Some remembered Margaret. Some had letters of their own. Some had family stories about land sold under pressure or mineral leases signed without explanation. An older woman named Ruth Bell arrived one afternoon carrying a shoebox full of documents tied with string. "I knew your grandmother," Ruth said. standing in Samuel's kitchen. She was 84, tiny, and fierce enough to make the room straighten up around her. She told me once that if anything happened to her, I should hold on to these until the right person asked. Samuel looked at the shoebox. Did she say who the right person was? Ruth pointed at Duke. She said the dog would know. Mara, who had been drinking coffee at the table, nearly choked. Samuel looked down at Duke. You're becoming famous. The shoebox contained letters between Ruth's late husband and Henry Reed. Those letters confirmed that Henry had suspected Victor Langford long before he died. He had planned to challenge several transactions, but a sudden stroke ended the effort. Margaret had taken up the work after him, quietly, without wealth or legal training, armed only with memory and stubborn love. More documents surfaced. A retired surveyor mailed copies of field notes. A former clerk admitted that Margaret had visited the courthouse for years, politely requesting records no one else cared about. A local historian found newspaper articles linking Victor Langford's early companies to land acquisitions near the mineral formation. The story widened beyond the Reed family. Samuel did not enjoy being the center of it. When a reporter called, he refused an interview. When a community group asked him to speak, he declined. He had spent too many years as a SEAL to confuse attention with accomplishment. But privately, he kept going. Each night, he sat in the study with Duke at his feet and Margaret's photograph on the desk. He read her journals not only for evidence, but for her voice. Some entries broke him quietly. Samuel sent a postcard today from Norfolk. He wrote only 3 sentences, but I could tell he was trying to sound braver than he felt. Samuel's name was in the paper. I bought 4 copies. He would laugh if he knew. I dreamed last night that he came up the porch steps with a dog beside him. I woke up crying, but not from sadness. He had thought distance meant being forgotten. All those years, she had been loving him from afar. One evening, Samuel found a cassette tape in the wooden case he had not yet played. The label read For When You Blame Yourself. He stared at it for a long time. Mara had gone home for the night. Snow tapped softly against the windows. Duke lay beside the desk. Samuel placed the tape into the old recorder. Static hissed, then Margaret's voice filled the room. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, and Samuel had to close his eyes. "If you are listening to this one, then you have probably found a way to make my choices your burden. You always did that. Even as a boy, you thought love meant carrying the heaviest thing in the room." Samuel covered his mouth with one hand. Her voice continued. "I did not tell you everything because you were young, then gone, then fighting battles I could not understand. I wanted you to live. I wanted you to have a life beyond old wounds and old land. If I failed to call enough, forgive me. Pride is a foolish fence, and I helped build it between us." The tape crackled. "I was not alone, Samuel. Your grandfather's courage stayed with me. God stayed with me. And in the end, I knew the truth would find the right guardian. Not because you are perfect, because you know what it means to stand between harm and the people who cannot stop it themselves." Samuel bowed his head. Duke rose and pressed his body against Samuel's chair. Margaret's voice softened. "Home is not a house. It is the person you become when you stop running from your past." The tape ended. Samuel sat in silence until the snow outside covered the meadow white. The confrontation with Victor Langford came in early December. By then, Victor was an old man in his 80s, though money had preserved him better than kindness would have. He arrived in a black SUV with a driver and a younger attorney Samuel recognized from Mara's files. He did not ask permission to come up the porch steps, but Samuel opened the door before he could knock. Duke stood beside him. Victor looked at the dog first. For a brief moment, something like fear crossed his face. "Mr. Reed," he said. "Mr. Langford." Victor forced a smile. "Your grandmother spoke of you." "I've been learning what she spoke of." The old man's smile disappeared. Mara arrived 10 minutes later, having been called the moment the SUV turned into the lane. She stepped onto the porch with a folder under her arm. "Any conversation happens with counsel present," she said. Victor's attorney objected to the word counsel, as if it offended him personally. Mara ignored him. They sat in the parlor because Samuel refused to invite them into the study. Victor looked around the house with the familiarity of someone who had been there many times and the discomfort of someone who knew the house remembered him. "You should sell," he said finally. Samuel folded his hands. "No, this property has caused your family nothing but pain. People caused that pain. The property just stood here." Victor's jaw tightened. "You have no idea what your grandmother thought she knew." Mara opened her folder. We have a fairly detailed idea. Victor looked at her sharply. Mara placed copies of 3 documents on the coffee table. Not originals. Never originals. Independent Geological Report, dated 1978. Correspondence referencing that report before the Reed family sale in 1981. Survey alteration notes from 1983. There is more. Victor's attorney leaned forward. These are historical documents of uncertain relevance. Mara smiled. That is a sentence people use when they hope relevance will be expensive to prove. Samuel watched Victor, not the attorney. The old man's hands trembled slightly. You think I stole from them, Victor said. I think my grandmother believed you betrayed people who trusted you. Victor looked toward the window. Snow moved across the glass. Your grandfather was naive. Your uncles were careless. Everyone wanted money when it was offered. Do you know how many people begged me to solve their problems? Mortgages, medical bills, failed farms. I gave them a way out. You gave them less because you knew more. That is business. No, Samuel said quietly. That is what men call betrayal when they can afford lawyers. The room went still. Duke stood. Victor looked at the dog again. Margaret always had dogs, he muttered. She said they knew character. She was right. Victor's face changed then. Not into regret, exactly. Something smaller. Exhaustion, maybe. Or anger that had outlived its usefulness. You cannot undo time, he said. No, Samuel answered. But we can stop pretending it told the truth. Victor left without making another offer. 3 months later, the county issued its first public findings. The review confirmed significant irregularities in several historical records connected to Reed family property and neighboring parcels. Some issues were beyond the reach of legal remedy because of time limits. Others opened paths for civil claims. The mineral rights question became complicated enough to draw state attention. Newspapers wrote careful stories. Local families began comparing their own files. A few quietly settled disputes that had been dismissed for decades as misunderstandings. Victor Langford never admitted wrongdoing. He did not have to for Margaret's work to matter. The official records began to change. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Justice in real life rarely arrives like a lightning strike. It comes in. Corrections, affidavits, hearings, certified copies, apologies that are too late but still necessary, and old people sitting at kitchen tables saying, I knew I was not crazy. Samuel attended some meetings, but spoke only when asked. When he did speak, he kept his words simple. My grandmother did not leave me a treasure, he told a county panel one cold morning. She left me responsibility. She wanted the truth protected. That is what I am trying to do. Afterward, Ruth Bell squeezed his hand and said, she would be proud. Samuel had to step outside before he could answer. As winter deepened, the farmhouse became less of a mystery and more of a home. At first, Samuel told himself he was staying only until the records were safe. Then Mara found a veterans legal aid program that helped him straighten out old benefits. A local contractor repaired the porch in exchange for access to some historical photographs for his mother, who had grown up nearby. A church group brought firewood without asking too many questions. Ruth delivered casseroles and criticized the state of the curtains until Samuel agreed to let her help wash them. The house responded to care. Windows were repaired. The roof was patched. The kitchen walls were scrubbed and painted a warm cream color close to what Margaret had used years before. Samuel fixed the fence with his own hands, slow work that left his back aching and his mind peaceful. He found Henry's tools in the barn, cleaned them, and hung them in careful order. Duke explored every room as if inspecting restoration progress. He claimed the rug beside the fireplace. He watched squirrels from the porch. He followed Samuel to the mailbox every morning, even when there was nothing inside but flyers and official letters full of language that made Mara sigh. Slowly, Samuel's body remembered what it felt like to belong somewhere. He still had hard nights. Some mornings he woke before dawn with his heart pounding, certain he was back in the truck, cold and alone. Some days shame came for him without warning, whispering that a man who had lost so much did not deserve a house, a legacy, or forgiveness. On those days, Duke stayed closer. The dog would lean against him until Samuel put a hand on his head. That simple weight could pull him back from places memory tried to take him. By spring, the meadow turned green. The legal process continued, but the frantic edge had faded. The most important documents had been preserved in multiple archives. Copies went to the County Historical Society, the university, and affected families. The secret no longer depended on one old woman's courage or one old man's truck. Truth had witnesses now. By August, the porch swing hung from new chains where the old hooks had rusted. Samuel sat there each evening with Duke at his feet, watching sunset pour gold across the meadow. Sometimes neighbors stopped by. Sometimes Mara came with more paperwork and stayed for supper. Sometimes Ruth arrived with pie and complaints about everyone's driving. The house filled with ordinary sounds again. Footsteps, dishes, laughter, the low thump of Duke's tail against the floor. One evening, nearly a year after the letter arrived, Samuel walked alone to the study. He had cleaned and restored the room, but left its heart unchanged. The desk still sat beneath the lace-curtained window. The photograph of Margaret and the 10-year-old boy remained beside the lamp. The hidden bookshelf stood open now, no longer a secret. The wooden chest rested on a side table. Samuel opened it and took out the brass key. It looked smaller than he remembered. Duke entered the study and sat beside him. Samuel smiled. "You think it's time?" The dog's ears lifted. Samuel placed the key in a small shadow box he had built from walnut. Beneath it, he had written one sentence on a plain card. The house was never the inheritance. The truth was, he hung the box on the wall beside Margaret's photograph. Then he stood there for a long time. The next morning, Samuel walked with Duke across the meadow toward the stone archive. Wildflowers brushed against his jeans. Birds moved through a sky so blue it seemed freshly made. The trail through the pines was familiar now, no longer mysterious, but still sacred in its own quiet way. Inside the archive, the shelves were clean. Documents were stored properly. Copies had been labeled. The hidden compartment in the floor remained open, covered by glass so visitors could see where the final evidence had rested. Samuel had agreed to let the County Historical Society bring small groups out by appointment, not because he wanted strangers wandering through family history, but because secrecy had done enough damage. Duke walked to the corner where he had first pawed at the floor and sat down. Samuel laughed softly. "Yes, I know. You found it. You will never let me forget." The dog's tail tapped once. On the way back, Samuel stopped beneath the old maple tree near the house. The rope swing of his childhood was long gone, but the branch still stretched out strong over the grass. From that spot, he could see everything. The farmhouse, the meadow, the barn, the line of pines hiding the archive, the gravel road where strangers had once come with offers and threats wrapped in polite language. Duke settled beside him. Samuel lowered himself to the ground with the careful motion of a man whose knees had earned the right to complain. Warm wind moved through the grass. Somewhere down the road, children laughed. A truck passed far away. Life continued, plain and beautiful. Samuel thought about the man he had been the day the letter arrived. Cold, hungry, proud, certain that his life had narrowed to survival. He had believed he was at the end of the road, when in truth he had been sitting at the beginning of a path his grandmother had prepared with patience, faith, and love. He had lost a home before finding one. He had lost family before discovering he had never truly been unloved. He had lost his purpose before a loyal dog and a forgotten key led him back to it. For a long time, Samuel had believed dignity meant never needing anyone. Life had taught him the opposite. Dignity was accepting help without letting shame turn it into a wound. It was admitting that a strong man could be tired, that a brave man could be afraid, and that coming home did not erase the years away but could still give them meaning. Margaret had understood that before he did. Duke had understood it without words. Between the woman who left the trail and the dog who followed it, Samuel had been given one more chance to become gentle without becoming weak, and honest without becoming bitter. That felt like a miracle larger than land, larger than money, larger than any official correction stamped in a county file. Duke rested his head on Samuel's knee. The weight was familiar, steady, real. Samuel looked toward the porch. In the bright afternoon light, he could almost imagine Margaret standing there, one hand on the railing, wearing the knowing smile she had carried through grief, betrayal, and all those years of waiting. Not gone. Not exactly. Present in the house she kept, the records she saved, the courage she passed on, and the stubborn dog who somehow became part of her final plan. "Thank you," Samuel whispered. He did not know whether he was speaking to his grandmother, to Duke, to God, or to the life that had brought him home by a road he never would have chosen. Maybe all of them. The sun drifted lower, turning the fields gold. Duke stayed beside him, as he always had. Loyal through rain, hunger, shame, danger, and the long, quiet work of healing. And in that stillness, Samuel understood what the key had truly opened. Not a door, not a chest, not a claim to land or money or old victories. It had opened the part of him that still knew how to belong. Some people inherit wealth and spend their lives protecting it. Some inherit land and never learn what it means. Samuel inherited something rarer, a truth worth guarding, a home worth rebuilding, and a faithful friend who refused to let him walk past the life waiting for him. Years later, people would still tell the story of Margaret Reed's hidden archive and the records that changed a county's history. They would talk about the brass key, the secret study, the stone building in the pines, and the old Navy man who came home when he had nowhere else to go. But Samuel knew the deepest part of the story was simpler than that. A grandmother loved him enough to leave a trail. A dog loved him enough to make sure he followed it. And a man who thought he had lost everything discovered that sometimes the greatest legacy is not what someone leaves behind. It is the person they help you become.